Even if you haven't heard that term before, I'm confident that you know the stereotype. That's what it is. It's an image, one of the predominant images of people of Asian descent, East and South, here. Even if you haven't heard that term before, I'm confident that you know.
For most of you, if you haven't heard that saying called two-eyed seeing, that's when
is like a frog in a pot.
Yeah.
If you haven't heard that,
boiling.
Unusual pause. And if you are not, if you haven't heard, unusual pause. And if you are not, if you haven't heard that composition before.
Realize what that means.
Well, let's explain it. Stasis. If you haven't heard that word before, here's a dictionary definition.
If you haven't heard that term before, what a reticle, to demonstrate how we use the hit test API, think about a reticle. If you haven't heard that term before, what a reticle is an.
We are very proud, if you haven't heard, that our new residence hall.
watch. If you haven't heard that term before, hate watching is when you don't like
The Andy silly family room story. If you haven't heard that one already, it's true.
Which if you haven't heard that term, or maybe you've just heard it thrown around. Moving on to codependency, which if you haven't heard that term, or maybe you've just heard it thrown around and no one has.
Heard that name before. Mike's kind of best known for, and if you haven't heard that name before, release is our interview with Mike Burrows from StanceWorks, and if you haven't heard that name before, Mike.
Now, if you haven't heard that tool, there's a lot of YouTube videos here on it somewhere. All you gotta do is find them. And if you heard that tool, there's another favorite, interesting point of view. I have this point of view. Now, if you haven't heard that tool, there's another favorite, interesting point of view. I have this point of view. Now, if you haven't heard that tool, there's
Gaslighting is. If you haven't heard that term before, it comes.
If you haven't heard that, you're doing something wrong.
If you haven't heard that term before, is make sure that I don't get decision fatigue. And if you haven't heard that term before,
the idea is terrifying. And even if you haven't heard that particular quote, you've probably
message. If you haven't heard that, you need to download it and
Yes, I'm born the battle. So if you haven't heard that in the archives, go check that out.
Yeah, I mean, Art's an incredible guy with such an amazing background.
Go check that out.
Yeah. Point and
also a former guest.
Well, that you haven't heard that expression. Sometimes we'll use as part of a post-mortem, if you will. That you haven't heard that expression. Sometimes we'll use it in.
Yes. So if you haven't heard that, if you're listening to us and you're not in
Sounds really odd if you haven't heard that term before. Like, your grant award is executed, which sounds really odd if you haven't heard that term before. What it means is
Episode 6 of this podcast about 1980s Honduras. If you haven't heard that yet, I recommend you go back.
Anything that's mechanical as best I can. And what I mean by that, if you haven't heard that particular episode of Preneurcast,
enjoy that. If you haven't heard that before,
Corps, like as a Marine, I'm like, that's one of the guys.
Oh.
Anyways, so if you haven't heard that one in the archives and you're listening to this, definitely go check.